Hello, and welcome to the Overcoming Podcast with your host, Adriana Lewin. Before we jump into today's episode, if you could please kindly subscribe to this podcast, and don't forget to follow me on Instagram at _Adriana_Lewin. Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Overcoming Podcast. I am so excited to bring our guest today, and her name is Joy Rosenthal, and she is a divorce mediator and compassionate lawyer based in New York City. Thank you so much for joining us, Joy.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I am excited. I know there are so many listeners out there that it's very common for us, especially as parents and moms and whatnot on the Facebook groups. There's constantly people having conversations around divorce and how to navigate that process, especially when you've got kids involved. And so I thought it would be really great for you to come on and just share a little bit about your knowledge and expertise and tell us a little bit about what you do. And I'm curious what a compassionate lawyer is. So if we could start there, and then we'll dive into the divorce mediator.
Sure. So my background is a little different from most divorce mediators. I never was a divorce litigator. I went to law school because I wanted to work with children and teenagers. And I spent the first 10 years of my legal career representing children and teenagers in family court in New York. So that was kids who were in foster care. And then I also worked on custody cases and some adoptions. And I saw that kids were really loyal to their caretakers, whether there was a foster parent and a bio parent, whether it was mom and dad or mom and mom, dad and dad. There were a lot of different permutations, but kids were really loyal and they didn't want to have to choose. And so I spent hours and hours and hours talking to kids and helping kids sort of navigate and understand what was going on with the grown-ups in their lives. Sometimes having to prepare kids to testify. And it really gave me a sense of what it was like for them. So after about 10 years, I decided to go out on my own. This was in 2006, and to become a mediator. And when I realized I was going to do divorce mediation, I thought, this is really interesting because I'm coming to it from sort of a neutral perspective, because the whole idea of mediation, right, is that you have one neutral person who's trying to help the couple come to an agreement around time with the kids, but also around the financial issues. And I realized very quickly that my background was helpful in that neutrality. And when I say neutrality, it's not like I'm a judge at all. A judge is the one who's making decisions, and they might be like sitting there trying to distance themselves and trying to think about this in a very rational way. Well, I don't think that decisions around families are necessarily like best served by what would be the most rational thing. I think you have to really take into account the emotional experience that everybody's having, and particularly the kids. So I could go on and on, but anyway, that's where the compassionate part comes in, because I'm really like trying to be compassionate to everybody and trying to help my clients come to the best solution that rather than with most lawyers trying to get the best deal that you can for their client, we're trying to figure out what's the best that works for everybody in the family.
I love that. Yeah. You kind of briefly touched on something, and I'm not going to like jump down that rabbit hole, but through being a therapist and I have worked at a children's advocacy center and, worked with children, it often comes up that children are very, like you said, they're very loyal to their parents, even if their parents are neglectful, abusive. And especially as young children. I think when they start to mature and get older and start realize some of that dysfunction, that starts to change and evolve. But in those early years, like children are just wired to be loyal to their parents, to their caregiver, right? So, um, you have a very interesting story that I really want to dive into before we get all like business talk and whatnot, because I want people to understand like the personal side of you. Um, so, and you may not know this about me, but if you do, I have a sibling who passed away about 5 years ago, and he left his wife as a widow with a 2-month-old baby.
Oh my goodness.
So, hearing that you are a two-time widow, my heart just went out for you because it was, I mean, that is a very sad and hard thing to go through once. To have to go through that twice. I would love to hear a little bit about your story and what you've learned along the way.
Um, so my first husband um, was very health conscious and very healthy. His sister had just passed away, and we were traveling from New York to Boston, which is about a 3.5 or 4 hour trip each weekend as she was dying,
Mm-hmm.
for several months. And this was 6 months and 3 days after we got married. I came
Wow.
home. When I left the house that morning, he was on the Nordic track, which is a ski machine.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I didn't say goodbye to him. I left and went to the gym and went to work. And when I came home, he had passed away right next to this to the Nordic track. So I knew exactly like what time. It was about 10 minutes after I'd left the house that morning. He died of a heart attack.
Oh my goodness. I'm
Yeah,
so
it
sorry.
was really sudden, and like I said, it was totally unexpected because he was so healthy and was really loved. He was a professor and a musician. He brilliant jazz musician and composer. Um, so I got a lot of support from the people I worked with and from my family and from his students. But I realized almost right away, I remember thinking, this is like I've been thrown into a forest and I have to find my way out.
Yeah.
It's really dark in here. And the only way to get out is to get through it and to feel it. And I went to therapy, which was really important. And like I said, I had a lot of support, but I really had to kind of figure out how to rebuild my life.
Yeah.
So one of the ways I did that was by joining a writing class, and it was a playwriting class that was just absolutely an amazing experience. We had a great teacher, and it felt like we were sitting around his kitchen table and really helping. And about 6 months later, this other student came into the class, and he eventually told me that his sister had passed away also,
Mm-hmm.
um, and had died in his arms the year before my husband had passed away. And one of the things, and I don't know if you've found this, and I'm so sorry for your loss. That sounds
Thank
just
you.
terrible. I should have started with that. Um, but one of the things that I found is that for young people, maybe have lost a parent or a grandparent.
Yeah.
And so it's not that they haven't experienced grief, but it's different when it's a peer.
Yeah.
And people who've lost a spouse were mostly people who were much older than I was. So it was hard to find people that I could really relate to. So when Daryl told me that he had lost his sister, I felt, and he was a little older than me, but not much. I felt that he understood something that nobody else really understood. And so we started talking, and eventually that led to a relationship, and we got married 3 years later. Um, and it was wonderful, and he was really my life partner. And but he had sickle cell disease, which his sister had passed away from.
Oh, wow.
And long story short, in the beginning of COVID, in May of 2020, he well, in the late April 2020, he went into the hospital and he was there for 25 days and I couldn't see him. So normally we had kind of a routine down because it wasn't that unusual for him to have a crisis and have to go into the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
But normally I was there all the time. I knew all his doctors really well. I knew I could like go in that hospital. I knew all the places to sneak in and out, all the
Yeah.
entrances and exits and stuff like that. But this time I wasn't allowed to go because of New York was the epicenter of
Yeah. I remember seeing that in the news.
and it was really heartbreaking. And they finally let me go like an hour before he died. So I was actually with him at the moment that he died. His daughter, who was in California, could not come in for it. And it was heartbreaking for her.
Yeah.
And that I think the suddenness of Makanda's death, my first husband, and the kind of suddenness of Daryl's just disappearing because he walked into the hospital. I was with him. We walked into the hospital, and then I basically never saw him again. Those leave lasting scars. But both times, because I know we're talking about resilience, both times I kind of had to draw on my own resources and really the love of the people around me. I went back to therapy after Daryl died, and that was really helpful. And sort of it taught me that I was stronger than I thought, that I had internal resources that I didn't know I had, and that I couldn't do it alone. I really had to draw heavily on and depend heavily on the support and love of people around me.
Wow. I'm just, I don't even have words to say because that is just so sad. Like, again, to go through that once and so early in your marriage, that's just, I mean, tragic, right? You spent all your time with one person, living in the same house, eating meals with that person. They are your everyday, right? It's part of your routine. And you imagine this life with that person, building a future. And then that sudden loss is just not only are you grieving the loss of your person, but the loss of the future that you could have had with that person. And then you have to go through it again and seeing your spouse walk into the hospital and only getting to spend that last hour with him. Like that just, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, thank you. You got it. You got it both times. I mean, Daryl and I were married for 16 years, so it was different. And I had I had helped raise his daughter, so
Mm-hmm.
that was different. Makanda and I were planning to have kids, but that never happened. So yeah, it was a lot. There was a lot of grief both times, and having to figure out how to pick myself up and start all over again. And it was a long process both times, I'll say that. But in both circumstances, my overall sense was, oh my God, I am so lucky. I can't believe that these two incredible human beings loved me and
Mm-hmm.
were willing to spend their lives with me. And that's still how I feel, like just incredibly lucky.
That's really sweet. I love that. I think of that about my spouse all the time too. I'm like, I'm so lucky that he's choosing to spend his life with me because God knows I can give him a run for his money sometimes.
Right? Yes. Me too.
So, um, you identify very much, you understand the grief of starting over. And you, as a mediator, tell me how that has helped you in your professional life?
Well, I think of divorce as being one of life's big transitions. So, they say, maybe you know this better than I do, that like losing a spouse is one of the most stressful things that can happen. And the next most stressful thing is getting divorced, right? Especially when you're not the one who chose it. I mean, it's hard
Mm,
enough when you are the one who chose it, but when you're not the one who chose it, it's like, oh my God, one of my clients described it as is putting a bomb in your marriage, which is not like an analogy that I would use, but I can understand why he thought that. Um,
yeah.
it's it's just very, very difficult, and it's often, I think, as sudden for people, and as disorienting as losing a
Yes.
spouse. And so I feel like my experiences, even though I've never been divorced, but I feel like my experiences help me empathize with my clients and help me sort of guide them through on an emotional level. And that's another place where that's really where the compassionate part comes in, is that I'm not just thinking about how much money are you going to have or who gets the house or whatever. I'm also thinking about how can we make this as smooth as possible for both of you, which is why I do mediation. And there's a variation of mediation called collaborative law, but where you're still trying to help the parties come to an agreement themselves, and they're the ones that are making the decision. But instead of having one neutral person who's the mediator in between, you have two people who are each both advocates for their clients and two lawyers, but are also trained as mediators and trying to help them come to an agreement. So I think that my experience really informs the way I approach divorce and helps me when I'm mediating.
Now, your primary focus now, because I don't remember if we touched on this at the beginning. I think it was more of our sidebar conversation. You moved from helping children to now focusing on being a mediator for divorce, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you've been working with divorcing couples now for how long? And what have you learned through that process?
Well, that's an interesting question. So since the end of 2006, the beginning of 2007, so about 16 years. And I miss working with the kids.
That's
But
what you learned.
I feel like I'm helping them. I've really learned, let's see, that rather than it being an ending, I think we tend to think about divorce as being like, oh, the end of a marriage, the end of an era. I really think of it as being a transition from a family from one household to two, because especially if there are kids, the spouses are going to still be in relationship to each other. They're just changing their relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it's a change in expectations. So if I'm in a romantic relationship with somebody, I expect them to, like you sort of said, right? Like that we eat dinner together every night and that we split up our roles. Like I wash, you dry, or
Mm-hmm.
I make the dinner and you clean the car or whatever. I'll do the bathrooms and you do the vacuuming. And all of those millions of things have to change. Like all of those you're restructuring each of those little agreements, those little deals that we have with each other
Mm-hmm.
in a relationship have to be rethought. And that's one of the hard things about grieving, was realizing I had to do all of the things like cooking. I was never a really good cook, and I've had to teach myself how to cook in the last few years. Um, so you're really transitioning. And what I say to my mediation clients is I'm trying to help you get to, my ideal is if you could get to a relationship where it's like you're with the people you work with. You're civil to them, you're polite with them, you can work on projects with them, but you're not necessarily going to ask them, who are you dating, or what are you going to do tonight when you go
Mhm.
home. So you're engaging in a new kind of relationship. And that's one of the things that I think I've learned that's been the hardest, but that when it works is just beautiful, because then people can really raise their kids together in a loving way that's distant. And I'll tell you, I learned a lot about that from my second husband, from Daryl. He had been divorced. He and his first wife did a phenomenal job of raising their daughter together. They would speak every Saturday morning about how she was doing. They just had, I mean, it wasn't always easiest, I think, especially in the beginning, but they really had a lovely relationship with each other, and they were great co-parents. And I kind of use that as a model for my clients for what they can do.
So the added element of having children obviously makes things more complicated. Do you find that that is mostly the case? Like, do you ever have people that don't have children, but come to you and it's just, I mean, like pulling teeth, getting them to essentially work together to lead, go in separate directions?
Yes, absolutely. I think that some people, when people ask me how long is mediation going to take, the answer really is it depends on the extent of your conflict and whether you're willing to work together or not. I was working with a couple this morning. It was the second session and they're almost finished. That's very, very rare, but that's because they've really done a lot of the work before. When they come to me for mediation, if they've been separated for a while and they're both kind of settled into the concept and the understanding that they're going to get divorced, then it's much easier than if they're still living together and they've just decided to get divorced. That's a much
Mhm.
more emotional time. So yeah, part of it depends on when I'm coming in, when they're bringing me in, and part of it depends on just the dynamic between them. I mean,
Unless-
I sometimes I work with couples and it's like one says the sky is blue and the other says the sky is gray, and you're absolutely wrong. And I'm like, it kind of doesn't matter what color the sky is. Let's just see if we can like take step by step.
I know this might seem like a really ignorant question here, but because I am not never gone through divorce, if someone says, okay, I'm ready to get divorced, when does a mediator come in? Do you go to an attorney first and the attorney refers you to a mediator? Like, what does that look like? Like, how do you get involved in the picture?
Well, I want to answer that question, but then I also want to answer that question about the course because this is a good place for it. It really is different for everybody. I think that we're still kind of conditioned that if somebody says divorce, the next word should be divorce lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people run to a lawyer first. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
the lawyers will refer people to mediators. Not every couple is right for mediation. So sometimes people will come to a mediator first and just try to see whether it's the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's a little different in that. Like I said, I think it works best if emotions have settled down at least a little bit before you try and figure it out. Because there's a lot going on in a divorce, right? There's sort of the emotional separation, there's the physical
Mm-hmm.
separation, there's the who gets custody of the friends, as Daryl used to say,
Oh my gosh, yes.
right? And the family, the extended family. There's the financial separation, and then there's a legal separation. They're all different. They're all having different timelines, and they're all happening like sort of at the same time, and there's a lot to be sorted out. A lot of times the emotional separation happens first, and then by the time they come to me, they may or may not have physically separated. They usually have not separated their finances yet, and that's sort of what we're sorting out.
Okay.
And then the legal separation is kind of, I call it the period at the end of the sentence. Like, it's just like you've already done most of the other work, and then this is just sort of like the last thing that needs to happen. But what I found, I started this course called Landing on Your Feet, A Compassionate Lawyer's Guide to Divorce. And what I didn't quite realize when I started the course is that it really is for people at a much earlier stage than when they come to me for mediation. So it's
Okay.
really for people who are thinking about divorce, or who just realized that they're actually getting divorced, like they were trying to avoid it and or their spouse just told them, and trying to organize, like, how am I going to think about this and how do I know what to do? And so this course is an 8-week online course, and for less than the price of 1 hour of legal time, they get an understanding of, like, well, how does the law think about child support? How does the law think about dividing up property?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are my expectations? Because nobody tells you this when you're getting married. So it gives people sort of a way to think about things, and at least a beginning step off point for their negotiations.
Yeah, no one thinks about it when they're getting married because this, most people get married saying this is forever.
Right. And it
I
is
mean,
for half the people.
yeah, for half the people. And then there's that few, there are a few in there that are like, it's fine. I mean, if it doesn't work out, then we'll just go on to the next one. And if they do enter marriage in that mentality, um, but I feel like that's, not as common as people who are just more emotional when they do decide to leave that relationship. Um, so your course teaches people, I want to crack a joke, but it's kind of inappropriate, but I want to be like, so it's basically divorcing for dummies. Instead of going out and buying the book,
Exactly.
you get Divorce for Dummies and a nice compact video. I'm sure you've got, like, do you have worksheets in there that help people kind of work through some of that process? So yeah, I mean, who doesn't want to take part of that? Because there's so many questions that come up. And like you said, most people first run to an attorney. And my goodness, there's always a post on social media saying, give me the best attorney in town, because you want to make sure you're not getting taken advantage of. So this
Right.
is
I wanted to call it Divorce You, but that was taken.
oh my goodness. So what have you, like, what kind of advice can you give people in general? Like, what are the most common things that you notice divorcing couples going through that you just find yourself hitting repeat on what you say over and over again?
Well, the biggest problem is that when we go to law school, we're taught to be zealous advocates for our clients. So divorce lawyers will often promise their clients, I'll get this for you and I'll get that for you. And they're really only thinking about their clients. They're not thinking about the impact on the spouse.
Mm-hmm.
And so they spend a lot of time fighting with each other and a lot of time litigating. And I say, whose kids do you want to put through college? Yours or your lawyers? Like, they spend a lot of time fighting about things that may or may not be super important to their clients. And a lot of times you hear parents saying, particularly, I want to keep the kids out of the divorce, or even non-parents saying, I want this to go as smoothly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And that's at odds with their lawyers. So with all due respect to the divorce lawyers out there, I don't think that their goals are always necessarily the same as their clients. They keep the fight, they have an investment in the fight.
Yeah.
So that can be a problem. What was the question? What mistakes do people make?
Yeah, just the thing that you kind of talk about over and over again. It's the same advice that you typically give.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a reason to think about whether going to a lawyer right away is the best process for you, and to really think out what process what process is going to be the best for you? How much support do you need? How much is harmony important versus how much can you, is it realistic to think that you and your spouse can work together on an agreement? I mean, sometimes there's domestic violence or there's a
Yeah.
huge power imbalance, and it's very hard.
I was about to ask a question on that. Like when you're dealing with people who have leaned towards maybe some narcissism or domestic violence, like how that process changes for someone trying to go through divorce. Like, would they, just kind of, yeah, whatever insight you can give for that.
They might need a lawyer. They might need a regular lawyer. They might need a collaborative attorney. It can be very hard. There's different attitudes about whether mediation is appropriate when there's a big power imbalance. Sometimes the person who's identified as the survivor or the victim might want mediation because they don't want to ruffle the feathers of their spouse, and sometimes it's important for them to just get out no matter what, like figure out, like, I will rebuild my life. I just need to get out of this relationship and want to do it in the smoothest, easiest way. And sometimes they really need a strong advocate. So every situation is different.
Yeah, I could definitely see that, especially if you have certain people with that victim identification, right? If they go in being afraid to speak up or to advocate for themselves with someone who may not be safe physically or emotionally, So you touched on something briefly just a second ago, and basically was rebuilding your life after. Tell me what kind of insight you can provide for people who are in the process of getting divorced, like words of encouragement or just, I don't want to be like, you've got this, right? But like, what can you tell people who are going through that process that might need a little more validation, encouragement of sorts, that they can navigate this, or things to be aware of while they're going through that process, or even after the process of like finalizing your divorce?
Well, the way I said that after I lost each of my husbands, I really depended on my family and my community. I think the same is true at the end of a marriage.
Mm-hmm.
As you're kind of redefining yourself and figuring out who are you going to be now,
Mm-hmm.
and how are you going to change, and how are you going to use this experience to make you stronger. So I have seen clients start whole new businesses or develop a career that they didn't think they were going to have, or decide to switch their careers in a way that fit their new persona.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been really beautiful. I also think it's important to really think closely about who are your guides going to be through this, because your sister-in-law's brother who went through a divorce, that experience might be very different from your experience. So in some ways they might be helpful. In some ways you might have to take it with a grain of salt.
Mm-hmm.
So I think overall what I'm saying is absolutely seek out people who've gone through the experience and who can give you advice, and whatever kind of counselors or therapists, that's great. I also think it's really helpful to either speak to a financial person or sit down and really figure out what your budget's going to be and make sure that you're going to have enough to live on before you agree to anything. And think about what can you do to be more independent than maybe you've been. But it's taking care of yourself emotionally, and I want to say spiritually, but I don't mean religiously. I mean just sort of like just taking care of yourself in a way that you might not have before is really important, because it's
Yeah.
easy to put everybody else first, but you're here for the long haul. You've got a long time of your life left to, and a lot of work to do ahead of you to sort of reestablish yourself. So it's important to take care of yourself so that you can do that.
What about when children are involved? You mentioned that you're very passionate about helping the children still, but even if you're working with a parent. So tell me what that looks like for you.
Um, I have offered to meet with children, but so far my clients haven't taken me up on that. I think it's really thinking about their needs and thinking about helping the parents think out how the kids' needs are going to change over time. So if I'm working with a couple that has really little kids, we're going
Mhm.
to talk about what's going to happen when they're in grade school or what's going to happen when they're in high school, and how to make the parenting schedule, for instance, be more flexible so that it will evolve over time as the kids become more independent and want to spend less time with either parent.
Mhm.
Um, right. So I think that's a major way. And then also talking to parents about being a role model for their kids. One of the things that I like about mediation is that it's it models problem solving. So
Mhm.
and the parents working together to solve problems together, which is a really good and important model for their kids rather than
Mhm.
just trying to complain about the other person or thinking that all of the fault lies with the other person.
Yes.
Um, this is really like not about talking about fault. It's talking about how do we have this problem, like a math problem. How do we solve this? You know, how do we divide up the assets? How do we think about spousal support? How do we think about child support? We can figure this out. Here's what we've got. Here's what the law says. Here's what our budgets say. You know, we'll be able to work together to figure this out. So that if the parents can do that. Obviously, sometimes a judge is figuring that out, but I think it's
Do
better if the parents do it.
do your clients come back to you later on, as the child gets older and maybe there's more tension around the parenting aspect? Do they ever come back to you and say, we need to rehash some of these things?
Rarely,
Okay.
rarely. So I don't know what happens. I don't know if they go to somebody else to figure it out. I don't know. Occasionally they will, but not usually.
That's tough. Because you mentioned, role modeling for the kids how to problem solve and not putting it's not about blame, it's about finding the solution. Um, and immediately what popped into my head was, man, like all these kids in homes where there's so much dysfunction, where the parents are yelling at each other all the time, and they could benefit from having a mediator to be like, let's let's stay
Yes,
solution focused here.
right.
Like,
It's definitely easier said than done.
right? I mean,
Right.
role modeling, good
Help.
good arguing. That's a challenge, especially when you come from place
Right.
like from a background that maybe it wasn't as harmonious in the home. So um I really love your course though, because I do see that there is such a need for guidance um in those moments. It's almost like a minute of crisis, right? You get told really hard news and having to go through and say, how is this actually going to impact me? Not only maybe to some extent spiritually. I mean, that is still a part of the human experience, right? Coming to terms with what you thought your religion may have taught you, what you truly believed about it, and coming to terms with, okay, is divorce something that feels like it's going to say something bad about me or put me in some sort of like estrangement with the creator, but also being able to decipher like financial impact and what are you going to do with your kids. It's just literally taking your life. It's like taking someone's life and mapping out all the parts of it and saying, okay, how are we going to divvy this all up in a way that makes sense for everybody. And I can't imagine being the one sitting in your chair while you have two grown adults who are refusing to be good listeners and, really overzealous about proving their point. Yeah, that's got to be a tough one, because there's a lot of therapists who are like, oh, I don't know if I want to do marriage work, because that dynamic of having two people back and forth can be really overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it can be, and it can be really rewarding too when they kind of can cut through a lot of that stuff. So, but yeah, the course, and thank you for bringing it up again. The course is really, I think, gives, and I designed it to be empowering, to give people the confidence and the knowledge base to at least start the conversation from a position of power. And by power, I don't mean power over, but I mean power over yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that you have a realistic idea of what the range of possibilities is, because sometimes people come in with a totally unrealistic expectations. And to kind of know what to expect. And I'm there helping people and encouraging people along the way, and available by email. And we have monthly meetings, and I'm there. And the other thing that I do that I just want to mention is that I do a workshop at the end of every month for people. It's a free workshop for an hour, just so people can get to know me, called How to Save Time, Stress, and Money on Your Divorce. And that's really sort of going over some of the stuff we've talked about, but in a little bit more depth. And then at the end of that, I tell people about the course, but there's, of course, no obligation. And I try to make that useful. That's really, as I said, for people who are just beginning the process or in the early stages of divorce. And
Yeah.
so I try to
Well,
be as useful and helpful as possible.
and that is some very useful information, because, there's a lot of people out there trying to find guidance on how to navigate that transition. I would love to know, and let the audience, I go the audience, the audience know how to get a hold of you. Like, if they want to learn more about your webinar, or if they want to get in touch with you, what are the best ways that they can find you?
On Instagram, I'm Joy Mediator. And my website is joyrosenthal.com. So I'll make sure that you have all that information so you can put it in the show notes.
I will put those in the show notes. And I really appreciate your time, your knowledge, and just getting to hear your story of resilience. And wow, I'm just incredibly impressed by your story, just your resilience, and being able to go through what you've done, what you've gone through, and still continue to help other people in very difficult life transitioning situations. So thank you so much, Joy, for joining me today.
Thank you. This has been so much fun. It's been so lovely talking with you. Your clients and your listeners are so lucky to have you.
Thank you. Have a great one. And audience, if you want to know anything else about Joy Rosenthal, I will have her information in the show notes below. And as always, reach out to her or reach out to me if you have any other questions. Thank you so much for joining today.